In the ashes of the Third Reich, another story began, one not of generals or battles, but of bloodlines. The children of Nazi leaders inherited no medals, only shame. Some renounced their names, others defended them. This is the haunting legacy of history's most notorious lineage, burdened by guilt they didn't choose. The fall of the Third Reich in 1945 marked the end of one of history's darkest regimes. But for the children of its architects, it marked the beginning of something more complex, an inherited reckoning. Born into privilege under a fascist empire, they emerged into a world where their names had become synonymous with genocide, war crimes, and national shame. This is not a story about Hitler or the battles of World War II. It is about the people who came after the sons and daughters of high-ranking Nazis, men like Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Goering, Hans Frank, Rudolf Hess. Their children did not carry weapons, but they carried legacies. Some publicly condemned their fathers, others defended them to their last breath. Some vanished into anonymity, trying to erase the bloodline, and a few exploited their surnames, capitalizing on the infamy. Each response was a reflection of internal war between memory and morality, between truth and denial. This documentary explores those lives shaped not by their choices, but by the crimes of their blood. Through their stories, we ask, can guilt be passed down? Can a name be atoned for? Or are some shadows too dark to escape? Inheriting the Reich, the post-war upheaval. Among the first to taste the bitter collapse of the Reich's illusion were the children of its elite. In days, families that once lived in castles and commandeered entire regions were tossed into chaos. Some fled, some were captured. Many were simply abandoned. Dozens of Nazi families were swept into the tide of displacement as Allied forces liberated territories once controlled by the Third Reich. These weren't just any displaced persons. They were the offspring of men whose names now echoed in courtroom indictments, radio broadcasts, and public execution. Nicholas Frank was only 4 years old when he witnessed the bloated skeletal corpses in the Krakow ghetto. His father, Hans Frank, the so-called Butcher of Poland, was one of the most powerful Nazi officials, Governor General of occupied Poland, directly responsible for the deaths of millions, many of them Jews. Decades later, Nicholas would recall how the images etched themselves into his memory, long before he even understood their full meaning. Even at that age, I knew something was wrong, he once said. Later, when I learned who my father really was, it made sense. The evil I had sensed, it had a source. Unlike many others, Nicholas did not defend or protect his father's legacy. He would go on to become one of the most vocal critics of the Nazi regime among its descendants, writing a searing denunciation titled My Father's Keeper, in which he painted his own father not just as a monster, but a coward, someone who orchestrated mass murder from behind polished desks and velvet curtains. Etta Goering was 7 years old when the world she knew disintegrated. The only child of Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's supreme commander and Hitler's designated successor. She had been raised in one of the grandest residences in Nazi Germany, Hall. Built like a mythic lodge with looted art from every corner of occupied Europe, the estate was a monument to Nazi greed and vanity. But in 1945, as the Allies closed in, Hall was demolished by Goering's orders to prevent its capture. Etta and her mother were evacuated and later arrested by American forces. Their new home was a far cry from the opulence of their past. A cramped apartment in post-war Munich with paint peeling from the walls. Ironically, some of the stolen artwork, too large or fragile to remove, still adorned the place like grotesque souvenirs. Etta's life would be shaped by denial. Unlike Nicholas Frank, She refused to publicly condemn her father, insisting he had done everything for Germany. She became a lawyer and lived quietly, avoiding interviews, steering clear of controversy, yet always living in the long shadow of the man who helped build the Reich. To be the child of a Nazi official in post-war Germany was not merely a social handicap. It was an existential branding. Classmates whispered behind backs. Employers turned away resumes. Even decades after the war, the surnames Himmler, Hess, or Bormann could lock doors before they were even knocked on. Some children were forced to take on new identities to escape their father's legacies. Others defiantly kept their names, determined to rewrite the narrative. But for many, the shame wasn't just public, it was internal, corrosive. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and one of the chief engineers of the Holocaust, was one of those who never let go of the ideology. Captured by U.S. troops in 1945 alongside her mother, she spent years in detention, only to emerge as a lifelong defender of her father. She helped fund Nazi sympathizers, advocated for former SS officers, and became a staunch revisionist. Her existence became a chilling reminder that the Reich's ideology didn't die. It just mutated. Rainer Hess, grandson of Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, became one of the most outspoken opponents of neo-Nazism, racked with guilt. Rainer traveled across Europe speaking in schools, museums, and Holocaust memorials. He described his grandfather not only as a war criminal, but as a man without humanity who wrote letters home about family dinners while presiding over gas chambers. Not all Nazi children were captured in comfort. Some were thrown into Allied-run internment camps, indistinguishable from other prisoners except for their family pedigrees. They were stripped of their status, dressed in rags, and herded with thousands of other war orphans and refugees. Hunger, disease, and fear were daily companions. One such camp was located in Bad Wiessee, where children of SS officers were held as part of the Allies' denazification program. Here, Allied soldiers questioned, observed, and in some cases re-educated these young minds. What had they been taught? What could be unlearned? In many cases, the answer was troubling. Indoctrination had taken deep root. Teachers, party officials, and even parents had instilled a worldview that painted Jews as enemies, Hitler as a savior, and Germany's enemies as destroyers of culture and purity. Reversing these ideas would take decades, and in some cases, it never happened. The trauma wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Many children grew up feeling a strange kind of orphanhood, even if their parents were still alive. The absence wasn't physical, it was moral. What do you do when the man who tucked you in at night is the same man who signed orders for mass murder? Some children developed survivor's guilt, feeling complicit in crimes they didn't commit. Others dissociated completely, severing ties with their families, changing names, burning photographs, pretending their past had never happened. A few, like Monica Hertwig, daughter of Amon Goeth, the sadistic commandant portrayed in Schindler's List, searched for answers in adulthood. In the documentary Inheritance, Monica sits down with a Holocaust survivor who had been forced to work as a maid in her father's villa. It is a painful, unscripted collision between history and its aftermath. Tears are shed. Truths are spoken. No one leaves unscarred. What these children inherited was not wealth or power, but stigma, silence, and a reckoning that most never asked for. The sins of the fathers were not just remembered, they were etched into history with indelible ink. And the children bore the scars of crimes they never committed, living in a post-war Germany that was rebuilding brick by brick, soul by soul. By the 1950s and 60s, as West Germany embraced economic recovery and East Germany rewrote history under Soviet supervision, many Nazi children disappeared into anonymity, choosing lives of quiet retreat. Others stepped into the public eye, some as activists, others as apologists. But all of them walked through the ruins of a legacy forged in blood and ash. This was the true cost of the Reich, not just in the millions who died, but in the lives poisoned by proximity to its power. Inheritance for these children wasn't a gift, it was a ghost, one that never stopped haunting, denouncing the dark legacy. In the decades following the Third Reich's collapse, a few sons and daughters of Nazi leaders chose not silence, not denial, but open rebellion against the legacy into which they had been born. In doing so, they waged personal wars far more grueling than history books could ever record. Wars against blood, memory, and inherited guilt. Nicholas Frank's voice cuts like a scalpel, not just because of what he says, but because he is saying it at all. He is the son of Hans Frank, the so-called King of Poland, the man who administered the terror of the general government and facilitated the machinery of genocide. But Nicholas speaks not with nostalgia, not with hesitation, but with venom, a kind of righteous fury that has only sharpened with age. I despise them, he said of his parents. Every time I speak their names, every time I speak of their crimes, I murder them again in my mind. There is no ambiguity in his words, no softening. He speaks at Holocaust memorials and in classrooms across Europe, not as a neutral narrator, but as a son trying to cauterize a wound that runs deeper than flesh. In his book, My Father's Keeper, he doesn't just document his father's atrocities, he dissects the psychology of a man who, behind a polished desk, became an architect of mass death. Nicholas Frank's rebellion is not political, it's intimate. It's the daily decision to stand on the other side of history, to wield his voice as a weapon against the very blood that runs through his veins. For Ricardo Eichmann, the path was quiet, but no less profound. He was 5 years old when his father, Adolf Eichmann, was hanged in Israel in 1962. By then, Eichmann had already etched his place into infamy as the man who organized the logistical machinery that transported millions of Jews to their deaths. But Ricardo would grow up in a very different world. Raised in Argentina and later moving to Germany, he made a single, unwavering decision early in life. He would not live in the shadow of his father's name. To him, Adolf Eichmann was not a patriarch, not a misunderstood man, but simply a historical figure. Ricardo became an archaeologist, a scholar of ancient civilizations, not of Nazi history. And yet, when asked, he never deflected, he never protected, he never pretended. He supported Israel's verdict without qualification. He denounced his father's actions without euphemism. And when neo-Nazis contacted him with grotesque messages, Eichmann was okay. He responded with firm rejection. There would be no camaraderie, no kinship, no twisted nostalgia. I felt it was my responsibility, he once said, not to continue the silence. Ricardo Eichmann didn't write fiery books. He didn't give speeches in front of cameras. But in his quiet refusal to accept denial, he did something remarkable. He reclaimed the narrative not by rewriting history, but by confronting it head on. When Rainer Hess stood at the gates of Auschwitz in 2011, he was not just another visitor. He was the grandson of Rudolf Hess, the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz, responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people. It was Hess who oversaw the construction of the gas chambers. Hess who experimented with Zyklon B. Hess who signed orders and then went home to tuck his children into bed. Rainer grew up with the shadows, but the truth came later. When he learned what his grandfather had done, the knowledge shattered him. But rather than run from it, Rainer turned toward it. He became an activist, a speaker, a bearer of the terrible truth. And so when he walked the grounds of Auschwitz decades later, he did so not as a tourist, but as a living contradiction. In front of a group of Israeli students, many of them children of survivors, he spoke about guilt, responsibility, and the choice not to look away. One survivor, an elderly woman whose family had perished in the camp, walked up to him. She looked him in the eye, took his hand, and said simply, "You weren't there. You didn't do it." The moment was raw. Rainer wept. So did many others. He hadn't come to seek forgiveness, but he found something else, the fragile beginning of understanding. For every Nicholas Frank or Ricardo Eichmann, there were families where silence reigned. Many children of Nazi officials grew up in households where the war was never mentioned, where the word Auschwitz was never uttered, where medals were hidden in drawers and old photographs carefully cropped. This silence was not passive, it was deliberate, a shield forged from shame, fear, and generational trauma. Breaking that silence was an act of rebellion, one that often led to exile within one's own family. Nicholas Frank's siblings disowned him for his public denunciations. They accused him of exploiting the family name, of tarnishing their father's memory. But Nicholas refused to be quiet. "I was the only one willing to say the truth," he said, "and for that, I lost them." Rainer Hess suffered similarly. When he began speaking out, his own relatives branded him a traitor. He received threats from neo-Nazis and even from those who shared his blood. But he persisted, believing that the burden of memory was his to carry, not as punishment, but as penance. The children who denounced their parents did more than speak. They testified. In classrooms, they spoke to teenagers who knew the Holocaust only through textbooks. In documentaries, they offered raw, unfiltered glimpses into lives torn between guilt and conscience. In books, they wrote the untold stories, the ones not found in verdicts or archives. They weren't just sharing facts. They were sharing the cost of complicity. Their voices became bridges connecting the past to the present, reminding the world that history is not just names and numbers, but choices. That evil doesn't begin in camps or gas chambers. It begins in living rooms, in silence, in obedience, and that it can be stopped if the next generation chooses to confront rather than inherit. None of these descendants claim to have redeemed their families. There is no redemption for the industrial-scale murder of millions. But what they have done is reclaim their own humanity. By denouncing the ideology that birthed them, they redefined what legacy can mean. They proved that blood is not destiny, that history can be inherited, but it can also be challenged. They are not saints. They are not seeking applause. Many carry deep psychological wounds. Some wrestle with guilt they can never fully resolve. But in choosing to speak, they did what many in their position could not or would not. They chose truth. To denounce a father is not an act of hate. For some, it is an act of mourning. For the innocents lost, for the people harmed, for the person that father could have been. To speak openly about inherited guilt is not to claim victimhood, but to prevent future victims. And to stand at Auschwitz as the descendant of its architect is not to erase the past, but to confront it with eyes open and spine straight. The children who chose to denounce their Reich did not ask for this burden, but they carried it, not for themselves, but for history. Their legacy is not stained by the past. It is forged by the courage to face it. Denial and devotion. But not all children of the Reich chose to denounce. Some chose to defend. Where Niklas Frank murdered the memory of his father with every word he spoke, and Ricardo Eichmann treated his family history as a scar not to be hidden but studied, others walked the opposite path. Into the shadows of loyalty and illusion, they clung not to guilt, but to a version of love unclouded by moral reckoning. And at the heart of this denial stood three unwavering sentinels of the old world, Gudrun, Edda, and Wolf Rudiger. Each of them bore a name etched into the horror of the 20th century. Each of them lived in the ruins of lost power, and yet each refused to let go. Where others turned away, they built shrines. Where others sought truth, they sought vindication. And in doing so, they became not just descendants, but defenders of the very men the world had condemned. Gudrun Himmler never doubted her father's honor. She didn't flinch when she spoke of Heinrich Himmler, the SS Reichsführer and overseer of the Holocaust, not as a butcher, but as a noble man. She remembered visits to Dachau as if they were Sunday strolls through a park. She called Hitler uncle. She spoke not of gas chambers or shootings, but of tea served in fine porcelain, of laughter in Bavarian sunlight. When the war ended and her father bit down on a cyanide capsule to avoid standing trial, Gudrun was just 12. The Allies interrogated her, photographed her, tried to probe what the child of the SS's architect understood of the world she'd been raised in. But Gudrun didn't break. As she grew older, she didn't recoil from her father's name. She wrapped herself in it. She lived in Munich, but her apartment was not of that world. It was a mausoleum of the Reich. Photographs of Himmler in uniform adorned the walls. SS relics sat behind glass like religious artifacts. Even in her old age, she remained combative, militant in her views. She helped form Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, a covert network offering aid to former SS men, some of them convicted war criminals. Under the radar of public scrutiny, she funneled money, support, and sympathy to the remnants of the Nazi elite scattered across post-war Europe. German intelligence watched her closely. They monitored her activities for years, but she never relented, never apologized, never changed. Even in the 2000s, her apartment was described as a museum of memory, not of suffering or repentance, but of reverence. She died in 2018, never having publicly acknowledged that her father orchestrated the murder of millions. The only daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Edda had been treated like a princess during the Third Reich. Her birth was celebrated in Nazi newspapers. Hitler himself was her godfather. She grew up at Karenhall, a massive estate built from looted wealth, surrounded by paintings stolen from European galleries and palaces. When the Allies crushed the Reich and her father stood trial at Nuremberg, Edda still believed in the man who had bounced her on his knee. Even after Göring evaded the hangman's noose by swallowing poison in his cell, she spoke of him not as a criminal, but as a misunderstood gentleman. He was kind, she told journalists, peaceful, misjudged. Edda never entered politics, but she became a symbol of quiet denial. She did not preach, but neither did she apologize. She spent her life trying to reclaim seized family property, insisting on the nobility of her lineage. In interviews, she refused to answer questions about the Holocaust. Instead, she spoke about the gardens at Karenhall, the laughter, the music. There was no rage in her voice, only longing for a father she saw not through the eyes of history, but through the lens of a child shielded by silk curtains from the ashes of Auschwitz. She died in 2018, never once accepting her father's guilt. Then there was Wolf Rudiger Hess. He was 5 years old when his father, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer, flew solo to Scotland in 1941 in a failed peace mission. Captured by the British, Hess would spend the rest of his life in prison. His prolonged solitary confinement at Spandau and eventual death in 1987 became fuel for a new myth, not of guilt, but of martyrdom. Wolf Rudiger spent his life trying to prove that his father was not only innocent, but heroic. He claimed that Hess had been silenced, that his lifelong imprisonment was illegal, that his death, officially ruled a suicide, was in fact murder orchestrated by the Allied powers. He rejected the Holocaust as exaggerated or invented. He wrote books, attended nationalist rallies, and appeared in interviews dressed like a man who had walked out of 1930s Berlin. His biography, I Have No Regrets, was not merely a defense, it was a declaration. He cast his father as a man of peace, a misunderstood prophet, betrayed by a world unwilling to accept Germany's rightful place. Unlike Gudrun or Etta, Wolf Rudiger did not hide his beliefs behind closed doors. He stepped onto stages, spoke into microphones, and pointed fingers. He became a mouthpiece for denial and a rallying point for neo-Nazi sympathizers across Europe. He died in 2001. Convinced the world had committed a crime against his family, not the other way around. While Germany rebuilt itself brick by brick into a democratic nation, these three lived in private time capsules. Their homes were not sanctuaries from shame. They were sanctuaries from reality. A family photograph of Himmler smiling beside a fireplace, a watercolor by Goering displayed above a grand piano, letters from Spandau prison read aloud like scripture. These were not mementos, they were relics. Tokens of lost power, symbols of undying devotion. The world called it denial. They called it memory. Where others used their family names to warn future generations, Gudrun, Etta, and Wolf Rudiger used theirs to resist the very process of historical healing. Their presence in the public narrative served as a reminder that even when fascism falls, its echoes linger in hearts, in households, in whispered stories told behind closed doors. Their loyalty did not come from malice. It came from a deeply human but deeply dangerous instinct to protect those we love, even when history damns them. They did not see monsters. They saw fathers, and they loved them. But love without truth is a treacherous thing. It can turn memory into myth. It can turn legacy into propaganda. And it can keep evil alive long after its architects are gone, fading into obscurity. While some descendants of Nazi leaders denounced their fathers in public or preserved their legacies in private, another group chose neither confrontation nor devotion. They chose silence and often disappearance. For these men and women, the weight of a name like Goering, Eichmann, or Bormann wasn't something to carry, it was something to bury. They did not shout, they did not whisper, they vanished into new names, new nations, new lives, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. In a sun-drenched village near Santa Fe, New Mexico, a woman once known as Bettina Goering lives far from the ruins of her German past. A grandniece of Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, she emigrated more than 3 decades ago, putting oceans and silence between herself and the legacy she was born into. Unlike her namesake ancestor, who looted Europe and reveled in opera and opulence, Bettina lives simply, quietly, and far from the spotlight. But there is no peace without memory. I inherited all the crap, she once told a reporter with a resigned sigh. The burden of her surname, The grotesque legacy of her great-uncle haunted her youth in Germany. She was followed, questioned, and treated like history's debris. At some point, she decided the only escape was erasure. She had herself sterilized. "I didn't want to pass on the bloodline," she said. "The bloodline should end with us." There was no denial in her voice, just a cold, weary acknowledgement that some shadows are too long to outwalk. Her retreat wasn't born of shame, but of fatigue, of a desire to stop the cycle where it stood. And so she faded, not into denial, but into absence. Martin Bormann Jr., son of Hitler's personal secretary and one of the chief power brokers of the Third Reich, took an entirely different path. After the war, with his father presumed dead and the Nazi inner circle in ruins, Martin disappeared into a new identity. So bold. He studied theology. He converted. He wore the collar not of the SS, but of the church. He ministered in South America for years under his new name, a man carrying an unspoken history. For much of his early life, he avoided interviews, denied his lineage in casual conversation, and immersed himself in spiritual redemption. But time, as always, loosened the silence. Later in life, he admitted what he had spent decades avoiding. "I cannot deny what my father did." That sentence, spoken with the quiet weight of late-age remorse, was one of the few public acknowledgments he ever made about his past. He never became a public figure. He never protested. He lived out his days modestly, without the flags of the Reich or the fury of its enemies. Just a man cloaked in both faith and fallout. When Adolf Eichmann was tracked down by Mossad agents and kidnapped from Buenos Aires in 1960, it wasn't just a moment of international justice. It was a rupture for his family. His youngest son, Ricardo, would later denounce his father in no uncertain terms. But his two older brothers, Horst and Klaus, responded differently. They said nothing. Both lived in the long silence that followed the execution of the man responsible for orchestrating the logistics of the Holocaust. Horst remained in Argentina while Klaus settled in Germany. Neither appeared on television. Neither condemned their father's role in genocide, and neither publicly expressed remorse. Unlike the sons who stood in classrooms or wrote confessional books, they let history drift by without comment. They didn't deny. They didn't accept. They simply vanished behind closed doors. Even decades later, when journalists sought them out, hoping for testimony or tears, they were met with locked gates and silence. The Reich, for them, was not a philosophy to defend, but a shadow to be outrun. Across Germany, Austria, Argentina, Paraguay, and scattered corners of the post-war world, countless descendants of Nazi figures chose anonymity over explanation. They changed surnames. They filed paperwork to erase genealogies. Some emigrated. Others simply moved to another town and never looked back. Post-war Germany, riddled with scars, offered little comfort to those carrying notorious surnames. The burden wasn't always legal. It was social, psychological, relentless. Teachers glanced at roll calls and flinched. Neighbors whispered. Employers hesitated. In the post-war decades, to be the child of a Reich official was to live in a kind of exile, no matter where you were. And so many slipped into obscurity, not as an act of betrayal, but as a form of self-preservation. It's easy to assume that silence is complicity, that those who do not condemn are by default defenders. But for many of these descendants, the truth is far more complex. Some were crushed by guilt they didn't feel permitted to express. Others feared becoming icons for neo-Nazi revivals. Some lived in families where even private questioning was taboo. And some, like Bettina Goering decided that the best way to prevent evil from continuing was not to speak about it, but to ensure it could not live again through them. Their silence was not always cowardice. Sometimes it was surrender, not to ideology, but to exhaustion. Fading into obscurity did not bring peace. The names still echoed. The past still followed them. And as documentaries were filmed, as new trials unearthed old crimes, some of these descendants found themselves caught between two realities. One they could not endorse, and one they could not entirely escape. They didn't want to be spokespeople. They didn't want to be examples. They wanted to be no one. And that, in the strange gravity of history, may have been the most human response of all. Redemption and reckoning. In the long shadow of a monstrous legacy, some descendants of the Nazi elite chose a path not of denial or silence, but of truth-telling. For them, speaking the truth was not merely a moral act, it was an act of liberation. Niklas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, was known for his relentless public denunciation of his father, Hitler's personal lawyer, and the Governor-General of occupied Poland. His daughter, years later, reflected that this unwavering honesty became a strange kind of shield. By confronting the horror head-on, he had spared his children the burden of inherited shame. "It protected us," she said. "In telling the truth, he offered them dignity, an identity unchained from guilt." This confrontation with reality was echoed in the life of Ricardo Eichmann, the son of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. Ricardo did not shy away from his father's crimes. He actively sought out evidence of his guilt, searching archives for the very orders that had sent millions to their deaths. He wanted the truth to be undeniable, not just for history's sake, but for his own peace. "I always wanted to know," he said. "I never wanted anyone saying I didn't believe what he had done." To him, ignorance wasn't protection, it was pain. His rejection of inherited prejudice was not a hollow gesture, but a personal creed, forged in the crucible of historical reckoning. Others turned toward reinvention. Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's favorite architect, dedicated his career to building cities rooted in sustainability and human need, an intentional contrast to the grandiose authoritarian visions his father once helped realize. In interviews, he admitted he had spent his life trying to distance himself from the legacy of his father's name. By designing livable, inclusive spaces, Speer Jr. turned architecture into an act of quiet rebellion, reshaping his family's tainted narrative into something that served humanity instead of power. Yet for some, transformation required severance. Katrin Himmler, great niece of Heinrich Himmler, chose not only to acknowledge her family's role in genocide, but to publicly condemn it. Her book critically dissected the Himmler legacy, laying bare the complicity of her relatives. For this, many in her family shunned her, believing she had let the demon out of the bottle. But Katrin remained unflinching. She called Heinrich what few others in the bloodline dared to, a monster. In her eyes, true responsibility demanded a ruthless honesty, even if it meant the loss of kinship. These individuals, through memoirs, architecture, historical research, and activism, sought not to erase the past, but to understand and transform it. Their lives represent different paths to healing, some through dialogue, others through education, public service, or even complete rupture. While a few children of the Reich have clung to silence or denial, others have chosen to turn inherited darkness into light. They remind us that history's weight need not crush. It can also be carried with courage, reshaped into something redemptive. Each life, shaped by a Nazi bloodline, tells its own fractured tale, yet a haunting truth binds them all. The sins of the father became the inheritance of the child. Some descendants stepped into the light, embracing shame not as a sentence, but as a call to teach, to speak, to build anew. Others recoiled, buried the past, or even nursed its darkest myths. Redemption or ruin? That question lingers like smoke in a ruined city. Martin Bormann Jr., the son of Hitler's right hand, said it best, "You never escape from your parents, whoever they are." In that simple admission lies the weight of an impossible legacy. For these heirs of the Reich, peace was never a birthright. It had to be fought for, earned through honesty, action, and sacrifice. Some found it, others never did, but none walked away untouched. None ever truly stepped out of the Reich's shadow.